Hi everyone, my name is Miles and welcome to Eastbourne Radio, helping the people of Eastbourne listen and be heard. This is episode 1 in our Tapes from Eastbourne series. Our themes are people and projects. Our guest this week is Gina Miller, talking about her upbringing in Eastbourne and her ongoing connections to our town. It's a wide-ranging chat covering the cost of living crisis, the broken good chaps governance of the UK, climbing Beachy Head, and her conversations with young people in towns across the UK. Hope you enjoy. I'd like to give a warm, sunny Eastbourne welcome to our guest today, Gina Miller, who's an entrepreneur, campaigner, founder and head of a new political party called True and Fair. And some of you might be familiar with Gina through her campaigning on constitutional issues and landmark court cases during the Brexit process. But what you may not know is that Gina has successfully campaigned on other issues, such as education provision for special needs, domestic abuse, and transparency in the City of London's financial practices. I've just finished reading Gina's autobiography, Rise, which I recommend. I found it very moving, inspiring and hopeful. Having attended Moorhouse School in Eastbourne and lived in Old Town, Gina returned recently as part of her UK tour, and I caught up with her at a meeting in Lewes, where she kindly agreed to join us today. So lovely to speak to you, Gina, and how are you?
Wonderful to join you, Miles. Thank you so much for asking me. And yes, a very busy day. Actually, every day at the moment in politics is an unusual day, but yes, busy and really hopeful that we can make a difference going forward.
And I think that's what we'd like to explore, and understand what that might mean for our town, but for other communities and for the country, a really important thing. So I suppose to tackle that issue first, I mean, most people do probably know you through the court case at the Supreme Court that you won and required the UK government to gain parliamentary approval to exit the EU. What motivated you to do this, and did you anticipate the sort of personal security issues that you and your family then encountered?
Miles, I'm a geek. I'm a constitutional geek. You could say that I've always been interested in how politics work, how Parliament works, and how institutions work. And I've done a lot of work trying to throw a spotlight on the rip-offs and bad behaviour and in the financial services sector after the global financial crisis. I've done so in the charity sector. I've done so in domestic violence, supply chains, and modern-day slavery. I've always looked at where do systems work, basically, and are they serving the communities that they're supposed to? And I've had a real sort of soft spot, if you like, or passion for politics and the structures of political infrastructure, but also accountability, and do they serve the public? And that comes from growing up with a father who was very heavily involved in politics, but also personally, when back in 97, it was my first time I really got empowered to really look at how systems were working, because at the time, I thought there was a lot of, if you like, warning signs that our good chap theory of politics possibly wasn't fit for purpose. But back in those days, I mean, I was literally talking to an empty room, because most people presumed that if you have people with the right accents, who haven't gone to the right schools, at the top of our institutions and our political parties, then everything is in good hands. And that it would work. And I have always been a cynic from that point of view and thought we have to go beyond that. We have to look at really what are they delivering. And because we don't have a written constitution, remember, only one of 3 countries in the entire world that doesn't have a written constitution. We have a very complicated mix of codes and conventions and precedents that make up our constitution. And I was concerned when the whole Brexit referendum and debate was happening, that there were noises already emerging about the fact that Parliament wasn't important, and it was somehow in our representative democracy, it was this link going to be made directly from the people to Parliament and to then legislation, which is actually not how our democracy works at all. You know, if one day we get to that, that's the future, but at present, that is not what we have. And if prime ministers could get away with sidelining Parliament, we would have fundamentally changed our constitution.
Yes, and that's a very sort of profound analysis, but to act on it in the way you did that is something quite remarkable. Did you expect what happened?
No, I have to say, Miles, I tend to be so focused on what I'm doing. I can be a bit naive on what happens next when it comes, especially from a personal level, because I tend to focus on all the work I've done and I carry on doing. I'm focused on the cause, and I tend to be very passionate about what I'm standing up for. And I worry about failing. I'm not me personally failing. I haven't got a problem with failing. But if the attempts of what I'm saying, I fail to raise it in the public consciousness or raise awareness of these issues, what will happen from that failure? What will happen? What is the consequence throughout society of me failing to shine a light and bring these issues to the public's attention? But that's not what happened. Quite the opposite. In that very febrile environment for both court cases, what happened is it got so much attention. The attention got politicized and used, I think, by certain media to attack me, not what I was saying. So there was very little, if you look back, on what the case is about. I mean, it's been quite easy for me, Miles, because when I've come across those, face-to-face in studios or on debates, etc., I used to say very calmly, so have you read my case? Have you actually read what it is I tried to do? Because the attacks were always personal rather than what I was arguing, my argument. And it was lonely at times. It was very frightening, especially having to go through the process of being looked after by the terrorist squad, having my children protected. Actually, that was the most terrifying, the threats against my children being taken and killed. It was something I never, ever imagined I'd experience living in the United Kingdom. I come from a third world country. I expected there. I didn't expect it having grown up from sort of age 11 in the United Kingdom. I thought we were a very different sort of country. And I believe all societies have extremist views, but what happened, the shift we've seen over the last 5-6 years, is I think those extreme voices are now more center stage and are given more oxygen than possibly they were in the past.
I mean, I did read some of the reports at the time, but having looked back and read the book, I think it's a huge amount of courage on a personal level by you and your family. So I just want to say thank you for that. And it does bring us to a sort of interesting question, I think, which is, in a town like Eastbourne, which voted for Brexit by sort of 57 to 43%, how do we think it's going now? And what would we say to each side now? And how do we heal and come together?
Well, I'm on record as saying the day after the referendum that actually we had to respect the vote, even though it wasn't a legally binding one. And we were all Brexiteers now. I mean, that upset quite a lot of people who were sort of, if you like, on my side of the argument. But we have to move on. And that's what I'm fearful of, is that it's still being used as a political football. We still haven't concentrated on having really grown-up conversations on the fact that our entire country needs to move to a better relationship with the EU so that we can have a functioning economy, a functioning international place on the international stage, that we actually can deal with our neighbours and friends, because geographically they haven't gone anywhere, they're still there, that we have to find a way of working in concert against big issues that are coming down the track that have no borders. So be it climate change or mass movement of people or the new geopolitical alignment happening in the world, these are issues that we have to be able to work with our partners in a very grown-up manner. And I worry that it's still being used, Brexit is still being politicized, not just in the UK, I have to say, by some European leaders as well. It is still too febrile. It is still being misunderstood. It is still them and us. We're fighting yesterday's battles almost every day. And the issues in the future, we're going to wake up one day and they're going to be realities. They're not just going to be issues we have to worry about in 5, 10, 15 years' time. They're going to be issues impacting our lives and our communities and our children in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I just wish we could move on to that grown-up conversation. And I do think it comes from the top. I think it comes from leaders. And I think it comes from, and that's not leaders just in politics, but in business, in education, wherever they are. We need leadership to take us to a place where we can heal.
Yes, and perhaps to be able to have conversations grounded, in coming together and common action and common purpose, and as you say, to be scaled internationally and globally because of the challenges that we face. And I think it's just really important. We see that on a local level as well. Just going back to Eastbourne for a minute, your book recounts your childhood in Eastbourne, I'm going to put it like that, and you being at Moira House School. And I just wondered what it was like. I was surprised when I read the book to hear, I think it was the motto, "Other people matter."
Yes,
was the motto at Moira House.
Yes,
and I just wondered what those early experiences were like and what influence they've been on your character.
I think my parents were very careful when they chose my school because it was at a time, how life goes full circle, it was a time when my elder brother and I were actually being threatened because of my father's political activity. So my parents had discovered that we were on a sort of like a death list almost. Well, it was a death list. So my elder brother, 2 years older than me, ended up at Eastbourne College, and I was at Moira House. And my parents were looking for a place that they felt was safe, had a real community spirit, was beautiful, they wanted to closet us, if you like, protect us as much as they could, even though they were sending us 3,500 miles away from them, and they couldn't visit us very often. And so with the help of actually, how it happened, and I haven't put this in the book, but how it happened is that two brothers, they were called the Marx brothers, who, I mean, that really was their name, who were specialists in environmental studies. And my parents met them in one of their visits in British Guiana, or Guyana, because Guyana has a huge amount of virgin rainforest and is known for being the home of the most unusual species of insects and birds and butterflies. And so these two wonderful brothers who were teachers, my parents sort of said that they were thinking, and a year later, they lived in Eastbourne, and they said, "Oh, let us help you." And so they actually found, for my parents, Moira House and Eastbourne College. And I mean, they were wonderful, wonderful gentlemen. And I've always had the fondest of memories of them taking me out for exits and for weekends for tea along the promenade. It was, I think I had grown up with the Dickens books and quite a idealistic view, if you like, of Britain. Many people grew up in the Commonwealth, as my generation did. And Eastbourne fulfilled it. So for me, it was a beautiful enjoyment. And I still find Eastbourne a sanctuary. I mean, I come down a lot still. I mean, I sit in the hollows. I mean, I used to sit in the hollow whenever I could and write. I used to write poetry in books myself, a little bit, of sort of poetry. And I'd sit in the hollow and I'd love doing that, or walking down past St. Bede's and up to Beachy Head. Those, and I still walk, and I love coastal walks, possibly because of my days in Eastbourne. It's a way I relax, which I don't often do, but that's my peace and my sanctuary is walking coastal walk.
So Eastbourne sort of fulfilled your slightly Dickensian view of Britain, which was maybe one for Eastbourne to note, but at the same time offered you wonderful nature and solace and comfort. And I imagine being so far away from your parents and although albeit with your brother nearby.
Yes, and also my mother. I was going to say my mother was a botanist, and my mother had, from a very early age, she brought us up to really understand the importance of nature and preserving it. So being so close to the South Downs, being by Seven Sisters, for me, gave me that connection to my mother as well.
Did you also climb Beachy Head? You're a keen climber.
I
did. A keen climber.
I'm known for a bit of an adrenaline junkie. So I love climbing, and at that time when I could, some free climbing. So yes, I did quite a lot of climbing.
Wow, that must have been quite a tricky thing. Chalk's not an easy thing to climb, is it? I don't think.
It's not. I mean, it's you have to understand your nooks and crannies very well.
And so you do come back to Eastbourne then occasionally?
So my wonderful mother-in-law, we take her away 1 week every summer to a seaside town, because she was one of the Jewish children who were sent to the UK. So her memories of seaside towns are quite similar to mine, actually, as being a place of solace and refuge and filling us with hope and comfort. So we do at Seaside Town every summer, and this summer we're back in Eastbourne, which we've done twice with her. But I tend to come down at least once a year.
Lovely. I mean, so it's still a strong connection with Eastbourne emotionally.
Oh, absolutely. But also on a very practical level, my eldest daughter, who turned 34 last week, her father is from Eastbourne, so she goes down to see him. So yes, no. And I played cricket at Old Friston in the pub league there. So yes, no. I have lots of connections with Eastbourne.
And I mean, you might have seen, I thought there was a bit of rather sad news the other week, which is that Eastbourne was declared by the Trussell Trust to have the busiest food bank in the United Kingdom.
I was so shocked to read that because I support the Trussell Trust, so I do actually get their reports every month. And I sort of had to double take because I still even now find that very difficult to understand, how that could be possible. And I do think there is an issue about regeneration. I know that there is a pathway to regeneration in the town, but there are serious issues that need addressing. And yes, it was a shock.
Yeah, I know, I agree entirely. And I think I've heard that people are refusing to take food that needs to be cooked from the food bank because of their concerns about whether they can afford to heat the food or to cook the food.
We were in Nottingham, and 38%, the council was telling us, of children in Nottingham are deemed as living in poverty. And back in March when we were up there, parents were choosing not to eat 2 days a week or living on pot noodles. I mean, literally that's all that they were surviving on. But we discovered something else that a lot of some head teachers were telling us, that in the senior schools, there's a huge increase in bullying because children are coming to school where parents can't afford to wash the clothes. And if you think about that time in puberty, going through that time of their teenage years, so they're not being able, they're smelly, basically. They're not being able, parents and households are not being able to afford to heat water, so they're not having showers, they're not washing their clothes, they're not eating, they're fainting at their desks for lack of food. I mean, this is in Britain in 2022. It is absolutely shocking how our society is crumbling from the bottom up. And, I think there needs to be such radical change. I think free school meals should be put out there straight away, but I think we need to do free breakfast clubs as well now. I think the schools should be offering some of the laundering services for parents. We've got to think of how do we as communities come together and help. But then you've got things like municipal swimming pools. Will they be able to afford to heat? Will they stay open? Will any community centres be able to heat the services? The knock-on effect of all of this is enormous.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I know from, I looked the other day, and I think the threshold to be entitled to free school meals is you have to have a household income of less than £7,400. So one of the first things they could do is actually raise that, so that more children become entitled to free school meals. And the other one I was looking at, which is a sort of technical thing, is I also direct a thing called Tech Resort CIC, which is a local digital inclusion and skills company, community interest company. And we were looking at Healthy Start, the payment that young mothers can get to purchase healthy food. And the government, I don't really know, but they declared that from the 10th of March this year, they had to move from a paper system to an online digital system. And now there's a huge backlog because that migration's not happening very well. And you begin to worry that, the report I saw was a briefing for MPs by Sustain, the Food Foundation, that there are 200,000 people who have not appeared who were receiving Healthy Start on the new system.
They should have learned lessons, because when they changed all the PIP and disability allowances and said they were rolling them up and they was going to be all online, you've got people who with special needs or carers who don't have access to online and actually are not confident. And I remember a year later, after it all went online and the whole system changed, and then it was a one-off payment, that they declared this huge success, that number of claimants had gone down by however many hundreds of thousands. That's because they couldn't figure out how to access the payments. It's not because the system was working. It showed that the system was collapsing because people were not accessing it. And that's what we're seeing again. And so, this whole idea that you don't need any community centres or, citizens advice or banks, whatever, I think we absolutely need community hubs on our high streets to help people as we go forward. I mean, I think we've misunderstood the use of technology, because I think technology is a massive, increases, the understanding, sharing information and efficiency, but it shouldn't be a replacer. It should be an enabler. And that's where I think people are misunderstanding the use of technology in the social realms, especially.
One of the things we were concerned about once the Brexit process started, the EU settled status scheme, was our figures were there around 7,000 EU citizens in Eastbourne who are required to register. And of those, many had been here a long time. There were people in their 70s, 80s and 90s. And it was a digital-only registration scheme. So we set up a process to help people, provide the devices, help them actually do the application, give them advice on how to complete it. And in the end, we helped sort of 200 plus older EU citizens to actually gain their registration in Eastbourne successfully as EU citizens. But from that, it was the revelation of, it's like using the NHS app now, which is being pushed very hard at people to use the NHS app, is the most vulnerable people, the people who probably need it most, maybe the ones who have the most difficulty in accessing it and using it.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. We saw it in, the remote learning during COVID as well. That, the whole idea that you had online lessons, and yet you had households of 3 or 4 children all trying to do share one device. Technology is not, that's what I'm saying, it's not a replacer. And that's why I think it's such a shame, because it's being pushed that's what we do. Less face-to-face contact, less care and compassion for people in the community. And unfortunately, we will all suffer because of that, because we are social beings. We need to have that interaction, especially as we grow older, and we need more care and more. Isolation is a big problem in our society, and we know all these wonderful like Silver Line projects of phoning someone once a day, because there are people living in communities, I'm sure in Eastbourne, who have no contact with anybody, family, for weeks on end, and that isolation is it will destroy, it's soul destroying.
Absolutely. And I think that comes back to actually something that I read in from your book anyway, which is actually about kindness and patience. And I often remind myself, if I'm sort of in the queue at the post office or wherever it might be, and there's somebody in front who it's quite clear that it's probably their only interaction with another human being that day, when they're talking to the person on the checkout or a conversation with somebody else in the queue. And it's absolutely right, and I think your book was written obviously before the pandemic, and now we're living with the aftermath of that. And I think one of the things that has happened is that isolation has become more profound, and even with young people as well.
And that's a really worrying trend for the future, if we have people who are so frightened of physical contact, because we need it. But on your kindness, I mean, I have to say, my family always say a despair of me, that I have this rule, whenever I go shopping, wherever, I try and talk to at least one person in the queue, if somebody's elderly, to help them with their basket, to put it in. And I have a rule that we will all, and I make them all do it as well. So they've all got to go and find somebody to help and talk to, at least one person that day.
Wouldn't the world be a better place and a very different place if everybody did that?
I think I think our capacity to care is something that we have, that keeps being narrowed, when we realize it's the most joyous thing you can do, to know that you helped somebody or to know that you made somebody feel better. But it just makes the payback you get is tenfold from just taking the time to help somebody else.
It is, and I think that's part of our healing process, not just sort of post Brexit, but post pandemic as well. And it's now needed more than anything. I think, I don't know where, but 440,000 young people recently completed a survey called Make Your Mark. That's across the United Kingdom, and their top concerns were sort of job, money, health and well-being, environment and education. I'm thinking about from a young person's perspective, because it's still quite difficult for their voices to break out, and even more difficult for them to influence policy. So how's the True and Fair Party address that?
In our tour of the 20 odd we've done so far, there's been a strong focus on universities and sixth forms. I was up in Cardiff University last week, and I have to say, really wonderful, Miles, in that we arrived into a lecture theatre that was so full we had to move to a bigger lecture theatre. So that was wonderful news, and they were very engaged. But I call them the burden generation because I can see the weights on their shoulder already. There is an unacceptable level of anxiety within our sort of 14 upwards. And I think it's a combination of things. I think it's because our educational system is failing. I think our system is failing to give young people the inspiration and the confidence that they need to go into the world, the inspiration that they can achieve, and the confidence that they are good enough. There is this. I hear it so often from young people that their focus on academia alone has left them in a single-dimensional view of themselves, which is focused on failing, not on succeeding. And I think it's a very damaging place for young people to be growing up in that sentiment. But also, we've got the damage that's being caused by social media, because social media is a place that is amplifying bullying. I mean, not for young people, but it's also creating worry for them, because they're not going out and just playing or just having fun and doing the physical exercise and doing the things they need to do, getting together in groups and just chatting and hanging out as young people do. No, they're being fed with all these images, with all these conversations, with all these issues, and they're having to choose sides so much younger. Whatever the debate is on transgender, on sexuality, on the environment, they're having to choose sides at a very young age, and that's very stressful. And they're having to think about things like jobs and money. Which 13, 14-year-old should be thinking about a mortgage, or can I own a home? These are not things we did at that age. These are things that we knew our parents worried about. So there's an awful lot that we need to address here, but I think it does start with education. And I believe, and we as a party are going to be publishing some quite radical reforms when it comes to education and training and age of leaving and entering school. So because we think that these are things, if I just give you one example, Miles, as we have, just to explain how ludicrous our entire system is, that the 3 terms we have in our school year are actually based on a long summer when children had to bring in the wheat, bring in crops. I'm going to make you smile by saying with the lack of staff and farms, maybe at post-Brexit, we still need them to go back and do that. But in all seriousness, we still have a school term system based on something from hundreds of years ago. We have children who, I'll give you another statistic, a third of our 16-year-olds are leaving school in Great Britain today without obtaining a grade 1, not even 8 or 9, in GCSE English or maths. That is extraordinary. And yet we're telling them that when they're at 12, 13, 14, well, what you need to do is read Romeo and Juliet, and study 1066. This has no application to their everyday lives. So if we're losing them at such a young age because they feel uninspired, unconnected with education, and disillusioned, then we have to do something about that earlier than we're doing it at the moment. It's too late by the time they're 16, 17, 18. We've already lost them.
And I mean, I noticed that one of your policies, just go back to young people having more influence, is to drop the voting age to 16. Is that correct?
We would have, I believe we need to have some citizens' assemblies. I don't believe in referenda. I think we need to gather public opinion on certain issues. And one of the ones on electoral reform, or 2 actually, would be compulsory voting, as they have in Australia, and also lowering the age. Because young people, I say, are much more engaged now. They have much more knowledge. So when we were 16, we were out worrying about a boyfriend, girlfriend, and who liked us, or which little gang we belonged to. Now, they're already talking about the environment. They're already talking about protesting. They're already talking about rights. They're already talking about, as I said, jobs, money, homes. And there's the absurdity. You can join the army with, obviously, parents' consent at 16. You can get married with parents' consent at 16. And so, but you can't vote. You can't have an influence on policies because policies are not something that sits in a book or are made in a building. They actually influence every single part of how we live every day of our lives, from the clothes we wear, the water we drink, with the food we eat. Those are all determined by politics and policies.
It's giving that hope as well, isn't it? Because I think, going back to what you were saying and conversations that I have with young people, both those that are at school and some that have left university and graduated, and often with very good degrees and can't find employment, is how do you provide policies in an environment where they can feel hope? Many young people, young adults, feel that politicians do know the science, but choose to avoid the decisions to implement the science in the way that it needs to be done. For example, to keep global warming, or the best chance of keeping global warming, to below 1.5 degrees. And so, and on the one hand, they see sort of endless discussions, COP26, Davos, COP27 in Egypt coming up, a lot of talking, a lot of people travelling very expensively in a carbon-heavy way. And so the breakthrough, I think, is for a party that, yes, takes the evidence, but then is courageous enough and foresighted enough to actually deliver the policies at scale.
I believe that we start with the machinery of government, because if we start from the top and we can change, the culture, and we can get better people in who are not so afraid of losing their seats, but they are there for the right reasons, to put the country and people first rather than party politics and loyalties, then what you end up is with the courage to make those decisions. Because I think if we are talking about things such as possibly discussing that politicians serve 2 terms, that we take away whips from the floor of the House so that frees up MPs to vote with conscience. Just simple things like, it sounds simple, but it is profound effect of banning bars in it's a place of work in the House of Lords, House of Commons, that are funded by our taxpayers' money. Not having voting at 10 o'clock at night. How can you possibly vote on important policies at 8, 10 o'clock at night? To professionalize the environment, because I think that will encourage better people and a better culture. As we stand today, there are 58 MPs from not just one party, but in different parties, who are being investigated for sexual misconduct and bullying in the House. I mean, that is an extraordinary figure. When MPs tell me, oh, it's a reflection of society, I don't know that that's a reflection of any single part of society or workplace that I know of. It is debauchery and there's decay happening there, and I think we need to fix that. So that's our central policy. Let's start fixing the machinery of government so that we can get better people, better policy making, better culture.
All the things we talk about rely on effective government, don't they? About truth, about fairness, about objectivity, about the ability to engage with people honestly about the challenges, and to live authentically within that role as well, and not to be constantly lying, hiding, or misrepresenting either the situation or what you're doing.
I'd say that a lot of what I'd call professional political advisors and strategists, they're a whole class of their own. and actually they influence a huge amount what happens to politicians and what politicians say and do. And when we came up with the name of the True and Fair Party, the wholesale advice was, no, you can't call yourself that. That's setting the bar too high. And I said, that's the whole point. Because what we're saying, the converse is is a reverse of that is, do you want lies and unfairness? So, I said, I'm doing this deliberately to set the bar high, because I believe that's what we've got to do. And that's what we have to do as a society, as a country, and actually globally, because many of the issues we've discussed today are not just confined to the United Kingdom. We're seeing them across the globe.
It's good democracy. Democratic systems that work, governance that works, engagement with the people, delivery on behalf of the communities. I mean, one of the things that's sort of crossed our minds is, going back to Eastbourne again and similar coastal communities, is that they seem to have a particular set of features. But there's a think tank called the Legatum Institute, pro-Brexit. But it does, and I don't know whether you know, but it publishes a UK Prosperity Index, and Eastbourne ranks fairly low in their Prosperity Index, both in the southeast and nationally. But one of the things they were talking about in terms of the coastal towns and communities is these characteristics. So relatively high levels of unemployment, often poor health education, weak enterprise conditions, that only 15% of school leavers progress to higher education compared to 24% in the UK nationally, and residents have poor mental health, with up to 25% reporting high levels of anxiety. And on a positive, that the strong local capital in the communities, with 20% of residents undertaking some volunteering. And I think, do you agree with that summary? I mean, it's a wide characterisation of coastal communities, but it feels familiar in places.
So, as I said, Miles, every summer we spend a week in a different coastal town. So we've done just about most of you can imagine in Great Britain. So we've done from Weston-super-Mare to Minehead to Blackpool to Eastbourne. We literally have done as a family. We spend a week every summer, and a lot of what you've just read resonates. And one of the policies that I'm very keen, as we progress our party, to think about is investing in coastal and seaside communities, because there is a huge untapped resource there, which I think comes from actually having not just alternative energy, because that's where some people are already talking about, but the fact that we have to think about food security as well, and encouraging more artisan production in different skills and different crafts. I think there's an awful lot that we need to do. But the community spirit of those areas are also incredibly influential when it comes to not just at the times of year when, for the citizens, but actually for people who visit, because I think we have to also increase the tourism map of the UK. And that's another way of investing in those coastal towns. So I think there is a huge untapped resource there around, and it's been completely neglected. I mean, some of the coastal towns we've been to, the town centres, Bournemouth even, somewhere like that, the high streets and town centres are actually make you hang your head in shame that they're in Britain. And we've got to regenerate. I know Eastbourne has got a regeneration programme, and in a way that's inspiring that what you're doing there. But, it needs to be much more, I think, energized. It needs to have a sort of a much more energy put into those regeneration programs. But it's not happening across the United Kingdom in coastal towns. There is something, it's being neglected, and it's an area. If you go back to my idealistic view of the Victorians and the philanthropists there, the seaside towns were booming. They were the joy of Britain in a way. And if you look at a lot of the literature, if you look at a lot of the painting, if you look at a lot of the music, if you look at a lot of the poetry, it came from people in seaside towns around our country. I might not believe in his politics, but Henry Williamson, writing Tark of the Otter. If you look at all of these things that we look back, there is a richness there that we can actually, I absolutely believe that we can revitalize.
That vitality, that Victorian Edwardian vitality. I mean, even in Eastbourne, people are surprised, but when they learn that Karl Marx stayed in Eastbourne quite a bit, as Frederick Engels had a home in Eastbourne in Cavendish Place, and that in fact Engels' ashes were scattered in the sea just past Beachy Head, that George Orwell went to school at St Cyprian's in Eastbourne, there's some very interesting stories and history about coastal towns as well as in Eastbourne. And I think it's the regeneration, because you look at what we could do, and for example, Eastbourne builds itself still from the 1960s onwards as the sunniest place in the
sunshine
UK.
It's not quite of England.
Yeah, exactly. But we do have a very low rate of solar power regeneration. I mean, a really low rate. And that seems odd that a town that could...
It does seem odd. And also, I think the fact is, not only as a country do we need to really have serious solutions for energy security, but food security is also incredibly important. And food production and manufacturing and, all the artisan industries that could come from places like Eastbourne, East Sussex, and some of the seaside towns, because the impact on the environment of us importing so much food is very negative, but also health. Eating local and seasonal is something that actually is much, much healthier for us as individuals, when we've also got against the backdrop of a huge obesity and diabetic epidemic really in the country, and the health service cannot cope with that. A lot of this needs rethinking, but it all comes back to honest politics. It comes back to, as you said it yourself, politicians having the courage to have honest conversations with the public. And I do not buy in any way, shape or form an excuse I hear from politicians at the top, whatever party, is that the public won't like it. As if the public is stupid, and can be fooled, and they can carry on fooling us. I think that is so disrespectful to say that you can't have honest conversations with people. People are living their lives every day. They can see the impact. It's not something, it's an intellectual dishonesty that I really abhor whenever I speak to politicians.
Yes, thank you, Gina. And I think it is. And it's also about the retention of power to a small number of people, or, and not wanting to engage, because part of the engagement would be to be held account or to account, which, of course, they're elected by us and employed by us,
and it's our
citizens.
money.
And it's our money, and citizens, we have rights.
But also part of the reform has got to be a huge devolving of power to local communities, not just policy making, but funding as well. We have got to get back. You can't have, as I went up to Yorkshire and Humber, one of the poorest parts in Europe is in our country, in Yorkshire and Humber. And how can you have policies there that are similar to policies in Eastbourne, that are similar to policies in Birmingham or Cardiff? Local communities understand, and local politicians have to have more power. And actually, some of that restructuring of government and bringing in more rules and legislation and accountability does also need to happen in local government as well, and in parish councils. There's a lot that reforming of the structures and machinery of government is not just at the top; it's also local and parish. It needs to happen at every level.
Yeah, and I think we'd all look forward to that. I think I'm going to draw it to a close now, if that's all right with you. So
thank you very much.
I think, yes, well, we all deserve better. I think I've sort of heard that somewhere. Gina, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I look forward to meeting you again at some point.
No, my absolute pleasure, Miles. And yes, I'd love to stay in touch.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tapes from Eastbourne. If you're interested in reading more about the topics raised, please find links in the description. And if you like this episode, please like and subscribe to the Eastbourne Radio channel to be notified of future releases and help support us. Thank you.